Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon, everybody. Just 1 minute before we start officially this exciting and important conversation convened by the Child Labor Platform. It's 2:29 Geneva time, so we'll start in 1 minute. But thank you, everybody, for joining us and for being part of this conversation today. We'll see how many more people are connecting in the few seconds preceding the opening of the side event, but I'm happy to see that there are many of you connected. Okay, so bonjour à tous, good afternoon, muy buenos días, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this side event on building more effective due diligence systems to tackle the root causes of child labor in supply chains. Today's conversation is convened by the ILO Child Labor Platform, and if you want to know more about the platform, my colleagues will be putting the website on the chat to be able to have more information on what the Child Labor Platform is and what it's about. This meeting today is convened and is preceding the 6th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor. I must say that this conference is probably one of the most important convenings on human rights in the world, and particularly on one of the fundamental principles on rights at work. We're counting with you all for your participation, your engagement, and for building and joining forces during this event that will take place until Friday this week. My name, for those who don't know me, is Caterina Torres. I'm Senior Program and Operations Specialist on Supply Chains at the International Labour Organization, and I'm joining you today from Geneva. And as we move forward, I will be the one responsible for making sure that this conversation happens on time and that we have as a fruitful as possible conversation with all our distinguished speakers. 4 years ago, we had the last Child Labor Conference in Durban, South Africa. For 4 years, we have seen tremendous changes around the world, political changes, economic, environmental changes. During this road from Durban to Marrakesh, actually the ILO and UNICEF published the latest global estimates on child labor. I think you are all familiar with these numbers, but it's nevertheless important to remind them. 1 in every 12 children worldwide remain in child labor. 54 million of them are still in hazardous child labor. But the global estimates of the ILO and the UNICEF also send us a very encouraging message. We're heading to the right direction and we should not stop our efforts. Importantly, throughout this road from Durban to Marrakesh, we have seen also a multiplication of efforts from governments and businesses to strengthen their efforts on the elimination of child labor, including in supply chains, to trade agreements, to import bans, to due diligence mandatory frameworks that have helped to accelerate some of the work that we are doing on the ground, in plantations, in artisanal mines, in factories, to make sure that every child has a childhood as happy as possible. It is in this context that I would like to set the scene for our conversation today. And for that, we have bring together one of the most fantastic panels with expertise and experience on the ground on how businesses, governments, and social partners are making a change. So let me and allow me to welcome that panel on the stage. And I would start with Mrs. Cardona. Mrs. Cardona, welcome to this panel. We are honored to have you with us today. You are Business and Human Rights Coordinator at the Honduras Business Council. Thank you for joining us today. And today, Mrs. Cardona will be joining us as well as the co-chair of the Child Labor Platform. As you know, we have 2 co-chairs in the Child Labor Platform. The International Organization of Employers, Mrs. Cardona will be representing them today. And we also have the voice of workers around the world through the International Trade Union Confederation, also a co-chair of the Child Labor Platform. So let me now move to Mr. Fahimoudi Pasha, Director of Workers' Rights at the International Trade Union Confederation, Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Pasha, we're excited to have you today and to hear more from workers around the world. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And let me now move to the Child Labor Platform members, so companies who are joining forces with the ILO to tackle root causes of child labor in supply chains around the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce to this audience Mr. Stefano Severi, Head of Raw Materials, responsible sourcing at Ferrero. Thank you so much, Stefano, for being with us today. And Mrs. Aude Traoré, Sustainability Manager, Coffee and Ingredients at Touton, also a CLP member. And finally, my colleague, Eugénie Valentin, who is joining us as Project Officer with the ILO and is currently based in Madagascar. So thank you all for joining us today in this conversation. And before we start with the panel discussion, allow me to have some few opening remarks, short opening remarks from our both co-chairs. And we'll start with the employers group, with Mrs. Cardona. Mrs. Cardona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, panelists, partners. It's an honor to speak on behalf of the International Organization of Employers, the world's largest private sector network. With over 150 member organizations across the globe, we represent the collective voice of millions of companies committed to advancing responsible business practices. We're here because we share a hard truth. Despite increased awareness and stronger legal frameworks, child labor remains a persistent challenge, especially in sectors marked by informality, poverty, and limited access to education and social protection. From the employer's perspective, we must acknowledge two realities. First, governments bear the primary responsibility to protect children, enforce laws, and build the public systems that make prevention and remediation possible. Schools that are accessible and safe, social protection that reaches vulnerable families, labor inspection that is effective, and economic policies that support decent work and livelihoods. Second, business has a crucial role and a unique capacity to accelerate progress. Supply chains connect global demand to local realities. Businesses shape purchasing practices, influence working conditions, and create jobs. Increasingly, we are expected by law, by investors, and by society to identify, prevent, and address human rights risks throughout our operations. This brings us to the core of today's discussion, the evolution from compliance to effective systemic due diligence. For years, child labor responses were centered around audits, codes of conduct, corrective action plans. While valuable, these tools alone are not enough. Audit-based models can miss risks, particularly when child labor is hidden in informal or household settings. To make sustainable progress, we must go beyond inspections and understand what drives vulnerability. This is where human rights due diligence, when done well, becomes transformative. So on our side, how does the IOE support the private sector? The IOE plays a pivotal role in scaling these efforts. We understand that navigating global due diligence requirements, especially for small, medium-sized enterprises, can be very complex. That's why the IOE supports our member organizations in building more effective systems by translating international frameworks into practical action, strengthening risk-based approaches, improve the quality of stakeholder engagement, promote alignment between corporate efforts and public systems, and as well foster peer learning. And this brings me to the next section of my introductory remarks, the value of the child labor monitoring and remediation system. This is a very powerful tool in the evolution. This shifts completely the focus from simply detecting non-compliance to continuously identifying risks while monitoring vulnerability and enabling tailored remediation. When well-designed and aligned with national systems, this can help detect children at risk more accurately, especially in informal settings. It can support context-specific remediation like school reintegration, family livelihood assistance, or service referrals, and generate useful data for both companies and public actors when shared and governed responsibly. But let's be clear, the child labor monitoring and remediation system is not a silver bullet. Its impact depends on how it's integrated into broader due diligence efforts and partnerships that address structural issues like poverty and lack of services. This brings me to the power of partnership. This is why the IOE emphasizes that effective due diligence must be collaborative, partnerships matter, and there's no better example than the child labor platform. The IOE is so proud to co-chair the CLP, and we're deeply supportive of the vital work this platform performs. More than just a discussion forum, the CLP is a practical mechanism for collective action. It brings together employers, workers, companies, and organizations to align efforts, share good practices, and strengthen credibility while reinforcing the principle that lasting progress depends on strong public systems and social dialogue. Truly, partnerships like the CLP are very essential because it raises the ambition and consistency. It enables learning and scaling, and it improves alignment and trust with our partners. We're already seeing promising practices where private sector initiatives are scaling the child labor monitoring remediation systems through their own due diligence systems, particularly in supply chains where child labor is deeply tied to poverty and informality. The message from the effort is clear. Monitoring without remediation is insufficient. Remediation without systems is unsustainable, and systems without partnership simply won't scale. So as we begin this panel, I invite us to hold one key idea. If we want a world free of child labor, we must build due diligence systems that go beyond compliance. They must reduce vulnerability, strengthen decent work, support education, and connect business responsibility with public policy and social dialogue. On behalf of the IOE and our global network of employers, we remain committed to this journey, supporting stronger due diligence, meaningful remediation, and collaboration that addresses the root causes of child labor. I look forward to the panelists' insights and to a constructive exchange on how we can better align our efforts, use resources more effectively, and scale impact so that progress is not measurable only in reports, but visible in the lives of children and families. Thank you so much. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cardona, for these very powerful and action-oriented remarks. And let me now turn to Mr. Pasha from the International Trade Union Confederation, as I said, another CLP co-chair. Mr. Pasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Catherine, and good afternoon, sisters and brothers, colleagues and partners. I am pleased to speak on behalf of the International Trade Union Confederation. For your information, the International Trade Union Confederation is the world's largest federation of national trade union centers, representing 207 million workers in 163 countries and territories, with 325 national affiliates. Established in 2006, it serves as a global voice of working people, focusing on promoting and defense of workers' rights and interests through international cooperation, campaigning, and advocacy. Colleagues, what I understand that child labor is not an isolated phenomenon. It is driven by poverty, wages, informality, lack of social protection, weak access to quality public education, discrimination, and denial of fundamental rights at work. When adults cannot earn a living wage and when young people do not see pathways to decent employment, children are pushed into labor. For trade unions, the starting point is very clear. Eliminating child labor requires full implementation of the decent work agenda. Freedom of association, collective bargaining, minimum wages, labor inspection, and universal social protection are prevention tools. Colleagues, the Durban call to action challenged us to move faster and to work in genuine partnership. This is why I understand that child labor platform is so important. The CLP brings together governments, employers, brands, unions, and civil society to align due diligence efforts with national systems and social dialogue. It helps transform fragmented initiatives into shared responsibilities. Colleagues, partnership works when each actor recognizes its role. Governments carry the primary duty. Companies have leverage across supply chains. Trade unions provide representation, access to workers, and sustainable monitoring. Together, we can address root causes, not just reputational risk. Friends, education remains fundamental. We recognize the leadership of Education International, which is a global union federation in defending free, quality public education, and the work of the Building and Woodworkers International (BWI) in creating safe transitions for young workers through skills and formal employment pathways. We are also seeing important openings in trade and business frameworks. Recent agreements such as the European Union Vietnam Free Trade Agreement and the European Union Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreements include labor chapters referencing international standards. These must be effectively implemented, monitored, and linked to workers on the ground. Simultaneously, we could also see global framework agreement are equally critical. Agreements negotiated by global unions with companies such as Inditex and IKEA shows that when freedom of association is guaranteed, unions can identify child labor risk early, ensuring remediations and support families through decent work. Due diligence must be real. For example, in mica mining areas like Kodarma, Jharkhand in India, experiences shows that mapping supply chain is only the first step, and without improving adult incomes, strengthening schools, and ensuring social protection, children remain vulnerable. Friends, we also value the long partnership with GILAF. You might be knowing is the Japan International Labor Foundation, GILAF, who works very closely with partnership of Japanese Trade Union Confederation, RENGO, JTUC, and national centers in India, Nepal, and many other countries, where practical supports, training, and community engagement have reinforced union capacity to prevent child labor and defend young workers' rights. But pilots are not enough. We must scale up by embedding collaboration into public policy, labor market institutions, and collective bargaining structures. Every purchasing decisions affects wages. Every contract influences whether a child sits in a classroom or at a work site. From Durban to Marrakesh, we have covered a long journey, but there's still a long way to go. The ITUC remain committed to working through alliances like the Child Labor Platform to ensure coherence between human rights, due diligence, development cooperation, and workers' voice. If we are serious about eliminating child labor, then decent work for adults and hope for youth must become a shared responsibility across all sectors. Thank you so much for listening me patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Pasha, for those very concrete and inspired remarks and for stressing the importance, I think both of you did, of looking at vulnerabilities, including the fact that deficits of decent work for adults drive child labor in supply chains. I want to also thank you both for the important role, the leading role that your organizations are having on the fight against child labor. And I really welcome all of you here. I invite you, all of you here, to work very closely wherever you are sitting with employers' organizations and trade unions and workers' organizations around the world to tackle more effectively child labor. I hope I will be able to bring our co-chairs back to the conversation. But now let me turn now to our panelists for, I think, what is going to be a very exciting conversation on what in practice they are doing to build those more effective due diligence systems. And to all of you who are connected around the world, you would also have a say. You would also have an opportunity to bring and to contribute to this conversation. If you have questions for our panelists, please put them on the Q&A. We will have some time for those questions. They are eager to respond to many of them. So let me then now open this panel with the very important participation of a very active member of the Child Labor Platform, Ferrero. Stefano, we have heard about this move that it's growing on not a very narrow compliance approach, but looking at a more due diligence, holistic system that tackle root causes of child labor. What has been Ferrero journeys on that? How has you been moving from that compliance to a more holistic approach?
So first of all, thank you, Catherine, for the invitation, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone. And before sharing the Ferrero approach or the new Ferrero approach, because I think it's quite important to always underline that it's a long journey of learning and learning by doing. Couple of premises. The first one is we are focusing today about Turkey. And in Turkey, we are talking about agricultural work that is carried out by seasonal inner migrant workers coming mainly from the southeast part of the country. So this is the first part of the complexity. Then two strong, important sentences that are in our strategy and clear in mind. One is child labor cannot be eliminated without tackling the root causes. And I think this is very important because this is, again, what is on the main topic of the today discussion. Then the second very important point is all stakeholders should be first acknowledge the structural and social economic challenges that are in the country. Without doing this, I think there is no success of the actions. Then for sure, you want to understand a little bit more about our approach. So the federal approach to address child labor has evolved since, I would say, 20 years, more or less, from a traditional compliance model to a due diligence-driven and systemic strategy that tackles root causes across its supply chains. So not only on hazelnut we have this approach, but on all the commodities, rather than focusing only on symptoms. So child labor, we have to have clear in mind, is the symptom of what is happening. Early effort focused on codes of conduct and supplier requirements, increasingly recognizing that child labor is a complex systemic issue requiring continuous monitoring, community engagement, and stronger prevention mechanism. Its human rights policy and alignment with international frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principle have reinforced this shift, emphasizing proactive risk identification and remediation. Our experience in hazelnut demonstrates that scaling impact requires integrating child labor prevention into social protection, education continuity, and formal labor governance, not creating child labor as a standalone program. Ailo Ferrero private-public partnership in Turkey is an example of our approach of operationalizing human rights due diligence in supply chain with the remedial approach, like identification, prevent withdrawal, referral to education, and awareness services. This partnership shows that when due diligence is embedded in a coordinated ecosystem linking enterprises, public services, and community actors, it stops being reactive and becomes to be preventive. For children, the most visible effect of our collaboration on the ground was the creation of protective spaces, schooling and learning spaces, combined with household outreach and referral system, dramatically reducing younger children exposure to hazardous seasonal work during harvest period. Importantly, this was not achieved through audits alone. It depended on coordinated actions by different actors. Collaboration, therefore, strengthened the preventive dimension of due diligence. Workers, children, and intermediaries are not simply warned about child labor today. They are connected to services, for example, health screening services, transportation, and learning environment that reduce short-term economic and logistical pressure.
Thank you so much, Stefano. And I take from that important first intervention this urgency to place due diligence within a coordinated ecosystem of other actors and to looking at root causes, including formality and social protection as part of a relative strategy. So it's just a standalone child labor strategy, but really embedding it to a more larger decent work approach. I think Tuton, that's also a child labor platform member, has also gone through a similar journey, if I can call it like this. There has been also a shift in how you're looking at child labor and its root causes. Could you also explain a little bit of your journey and where do you stand now?
Yes, I will start also thanking you for the invitation. And I will also start to introduce Touton, that is a sourcing and trading company based in France. And we mainly source and trade cocoa, coffee and ingredients, so commodities that are produced by 100,000 smallholder farmers. We are used to manage risk in the supply chain for a client. It is really our role. And our experience in addressing child labor started, like Stefano said, like 20 years ago, mainly in cocoa, at a time where some public attention was brought up, public reports, about working conditions in the cocoa sector put most of the chocolate makers at reputational risk. And it was a kind of shock in the sector. And it led to the development and the creation of two organizations, ICI and WCF. And so our journey on child labor started collectively. It already started through collaboration. ICI that put around the table civil society, private actors, NGOs, but also governments that had the ambition to address child labor in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana mainly at the beginning, made us work collectively to develop tools, to develop systems, to understand the situation in those two countries. So our journey really started already collectively, but with a compliance approach. We were focusing on monitoring child labor cases, remediating child labor cases, and our interventions were also driven by our client request. And it was really the need to comply, to address the risk, the reputational risk for us and for the client. The shift to a more systemic approach came a little later. And it was possible thanks to, first, our proximity with the communities and the farmers, because 80% of our staff is based at origin. This experience in the field, understanding the socioeconomic situation of the farmers, but also having the experience of what was working, what was not working. So this proximity was key in order to identify the root cause. Secondly, you know that in child labor we spend a lot of time collecting data. And all data collected on child labor, but also on living income, on socioeconomic situation of the farmers, also allowed us to have a more macro understanding of the situation and also to identify better the root cause and not focusing only on the household situation of a child situation. And I would say that more legislation, more guidance also from ILO, from the OECD, pushed us to integrate this systemic approach. And indeed, the exercise of doing our double materiality was key also to reinforce the need to address root causes and move from remediation to address root causes. So this shift happened, and how it happened, now we are just implementing interventions that address root causes, that try to address climate change resilience, economic resilience, but also access to basic services, access to education, but access to healthcare center. We also work on food security. So we really now have a panel of intervention that we implement on our own when we have the expertise, in collaboration when we do not have expertise, and also in collaboration when we want to go at bigger scale. So we continue to have a compliance approach driven by client demand, but we have made this shift in integrated this systemic approach.
Thank you. Extremely helpful and very good to see, I think, from both examples, how specific efforts on commodities that were very highly scrutinized, were still very highly scrutinized, have informed a broader exercise on different commodities or supply chains. So how do we take those lessons learned from cocoa to other supply chains? I think that's a very important point. Let me turn now to Eugenie, who is part of the ILO team. Eugenie, the journey on cobalt, and you have been working extensively on cobalt, hasn't been as long probably recently on child labor as for the agro industry, but lots have happened in the past few years. Could you tell us more about what has happened and what is the shift happening over the course of these past years?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. And thank you to Stefano and Aude for your initial presentations. It seems that we have a similar approach in all of our supply chains, which shows the long-term implications that we want to provide in this. It seems that we all have this first pillar of wanting to address child labor through different compliance mechanisms, as Stefano mentioned, audits, codes of conduct. But we saw that this didn't really address why the child labor was happening in these specific supply chains. We weren't understanding why. And these tools weren't necessarily addressing the long-term remediation that we wanted to see to eliminate child labor and to promote the decent work that is required in the copper cobalt supply chains. And this is where we see at the ILO and specifically with the CLP that collaboration becomes essential to really promote this long-term systemic change, to understand the root causes and to really attack the root causes in long-term remediation and prevention. So this is what we've been trying to do with the DRC government through the creation of the child labor monitoring and remediation system. So it's a digital tool and database developed by the government of the DRC a few years ago, back in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, which allows for government agents and technicians to be able to identify children in a situation of child labor, specifically worst forms of child labor in our copper cobalt supply chains, and to understand why they're working, how old they are, what type of households situation that they're in, if they're in a very precarious situation with no parents, so on and so forth. And from this data analysis, the DRC government can then refer the child in a specific case of remediation, so whether it's school reintegration, promoting them to a different apprenticeship scheme if they're above the age of 15, and also to tackle the precarity of adults and the households where the child has been identified. And this system allows for private sector, for the government, and for civil society and communities to understand what is missing in this specific zone where the child has been identified, and understand the root causes that is happening in that community to be able to better mitigate and remediate the situation of child labor. So the situation has not been to intervene in ad hoc cases, but to really understand how each partner can build on this data that we have received and to then create systemic change through different prevention and remediation systems. And it allows for a stronger basis for cooperation with local communities, understanding how government and private sector can better cooperate and have a specific structured dialogue to, one, prevent child labor from happening again, but to also work on better working conditions and environment for adults.
Thank you, Eugenie. And I think there is a echoing message here also from Tutone on how we're using more data, not just to monitor, but to really inform decisions on systems and root causes. So a different shift also on how we're using data. I think that's extremely important, how businesses and governments are sharing some of that data for joint responses. And that brings me to a second question for you all, which is, we have heard during your interventions that the issue of tackling the root causes, education, social protection, formalization. And we also know that while this is an issue of shared responsibilities, each actor plays a specific role. Each actor has a different mandate to tackle this root cause. So I wanted to hear from you, because that's not an easy balance to strike when you are under pressure to find responses, to be effective on your efforts, to show the impact of your work. How is that alignment? And let me start with Aude now. How is that alignment, Aude, happening between the government systems, the policies, and businesses' due diligence? How are you seeing that alignment? What remain some of the challenges, if you can share some of that with us?
Yes, you're right. It's not easy. I would just reinforce what you just said, that child labor being a complex issue, the private sector cannot on his own address all the root causes that smallholders can, challenges that smallholder farmers can face. And we need to work hand by hand with different organizations and governments included. I talked a lot about cocoa previously. I may give some example, very, very specific example, more in coffee, where our journey is less mature and more recent. We started to do some monitoring in some coffee household, and we realized that our results were really different from the national statistics. And thanks to the CLP and to the CLEAR project that ILO is managing, we had the occasion to connect with the government, to connect with the referral system, and to challenge this situation and our analysis and our qualification of child labor cases. And it's maybe a very specific example, but we needed the government, we needed to be very close to the national referral system to really understand their system, to understand their way of addressing child labor, but also their local resources, their capacity to respond, how we could work together. And our conclusion was that if we work with governments, we are aligned with the policies, we are aligned with their system, we speak the same language. It is an enabler to implement projects, to tackle root cause, to go in the same direction and in the, I would say, the right direction, I hope. We also faced not in coffee, in cocoa, some projects that could not be implemented because they were not aligned with the government strategy and policies. So for me, being aligned is really, really an enabler for action.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for emphasizing this enabling factor, including through data to policies to the systems on the ground. Stefano Ferreira has been working extensively in Turkey, for instance, with the government, but also in other countries with governments. Could you tell us a bit more of Ferreira's experience in aligning your efforts with government policies?
First of all, I would like to change the question because I think it's important to work with the government. No, it's fundamental. I think without having a strong fundamental work with the local authorities at local level and central level, nothing is possible, to be very clear. And I think going back to the Turkish example, we have partnership at different level, but I think the fundamental partnership are the one with the central and the local authorities, because without having this kind of alignment on a, I would say, sometimes on a daily basis, you cannot bring your effort into the ground. So you need to speak the same language, which is fundamental. And I think I go back to the comment of Touton. So language has to be the same. I think going back to the first part of the panel discussion, I think also the numbers should be more or less collected in the same way. Because if you start to collect numbers in a different ways with different meanings, you don't speak anymore the same language. So this is, I think, the basic. But then you need an alignment, I would say constantly alignment with the local and the central authorities, really to be able to deploy what you have in mind. And I think to make a very practical example, normally we start, hazelnut is a little bit different from cocoa, so we have a very short harvest, normally between 6-8 weeks a year. So it's more or less concentrated from August to September. And as I mentioned before, we have internal migrants who are working and for the hazelnut harvest, but they are also working on other harvests like apricots, like tobacco during all the year around. So they're arriving in the orchard on the Black Sea mainly, and we need to be prepared in advance to understand where they will arrive, where we need to open a school, where we need to open a sanitary facility, where we need to do health screening. So all this has to be planned far in advance, knowing on one side the crop situation. So this is scientific data, where there will be the hazelnut available. But on the other side, where the migrants will arrive and which are the needs. Because, for example, we open school, we engage with the support of ILO teacher, we open canteen and all these kind of activities, but we need to understand, are the school there physically or not? because sometimes they are not there. So we need them to prepare the correct transportation from the camps area to the school, so to avoid that the kids are joining their parents for the harvest. So there is all these kind of activities need to be discussed, agreed with the local authorities, and centrally before the harvest also with the central activities of the government, so that all the activities, the one managed by Ferrero, the one managed by ILO, by local NGOs, and the one managed by the Turkish authorities, are all working in the same direction, bringing what we expect. So no child labor anymore in the hazelnut value chain, and later on also in other value chain as well.
Great, Stefano. And I like those speakers who changed the questions. I think that was a great move. How do we work with government? So thank you, Stefano, for that. Eugenie, back to you. I think we have heard about how we work with governments, and there's a lot to say on DRC, but also how do we avoid, when we work with governments, to undermine the position and the role of governments on the ground. So give us a little bit of a reality check on how that's happening in DRC.
Thanks, Catherine. I'd just like to bounce back on what Aude said in her second intervention, where the private sector can't do it alone. And I think this is absolutely true. And it mirrors as well what Stefano said, we have to work with the government. There has to be a very good parallel coordination of interventions. If due diligence operates by itself for private sector without, consulting with the government on long-term efforts, you risk being fragmented, you risk being in a duplication of work, and your interventions ultimately become short-lived or obsolete. So it's really important to ensure that your alignment supports not only your due diligence work, but also the activities, the plans, and the engagement that the government wants to provide as well. So in that sense, alignment is key to ensure that child labor elimination happens through remediation with the private sector, but also in the alignment in cooperation with the communities and the authorities. And in practical terms, it means linking your due diligence efforts with the child labor remediation action plan of the government. And in that case, in the DRC, we have, the child labor monitoring and remediation system, which has become the government-led platform to identify and to create the remediation pattern. And we're seeing more and more private sector actors joining these efforts to ensure that this data is collected on one single platform. If we have different NGOs connecting, different data dots, as we've mentioned in the hazelnut supply chain, we're seeing that the efforts aren't necessarily realistic, they're duplicated, we don't achieve the results. So this is what we've seen in DRC. We've got cooperatives that have worked with the DRC government and the ILO to make sure that the child labor identification is operative and operational. And through this, we've worked with the cooperatives and the local communities to identify all of the primary and secondary schools that were operational to ensure that the remediation of these children identified in child labor can integrate an operational school. If the school is not working, then if we're sending them off to a school that's not operational, where are we going? So this mapping has allowed us to make sure the remediation is happening. We're also working with the adults, cooperatives, private sector actors, and the local community authorities. We're creating different community funds, caisse d'épargne, so saving funds, to make sure that these adults can actually chip in together and create their own micro enterprises, so that they're not necessarily dependent on the mining operations or the mining industry, but they have an alternative livelihood to make sure that the economy is thriving in different industries. So these aren't necessarily ad hoc interventions that private sector communities are doing separately, but we're seeing a joint force to align not only on what the national framework from the government provides, but aligning as well on the tools that the government provides, and make sure that we have a common sense of understanding of where we want to go as a pool of supply chain actors operating on the same objective.
Thanks a lot, Eugenie. And very concrete example on education, right? This mapping of public schools in artisanal mining sites and communities. I think that was a very concrete type of example on how this alignment and collaboration with government can take place. We're in half of our panel, so we probably need to to wrap up on time for some of the questions, but we're doing good, speakers, and I think our audience is still very engaged, and I invite you all to bring some more questions. We have received a few of them, but please come with questions. I will try to make some time so that our speakers can answer your questions. And again, hopefully some of those questions also can bring back to the conversation our workers and employees representatives. So we're now half of the panel, and I want to hear from you. Okay, we have talked about how important it is to move from compliance to a whole due diligence systemic root approach. We have heard about how we work with government. What's the impact of all of this? Does it make a difference to engage? And I know how hard it is and how time-consuming it can be to engage in that shift. I want to hear more about what exactly the impact is, whether that's an impact you're seeing today or the impact you want to see tomorrow. So maybe, Odd, let me start with you. What is the impact? How are you seeing the impact of your collaboration on the ground?
I will not answer about the impact on communities and households. I will focus on answering on the impact on our system, our due diligence effort, our collaboration, and I will take the example of the CLEAR project that ILO is managing in the coffee sector in Uganda. It challenged our methodology and our system. It helped us to strengthen our system. It supported us in innovating. I think innovation is quite important. And not only in coffee, but I think also in cocoa, in our experience, innovation came through collaboration and a collaborative project. I think that one of the impact of the CLEAR project is that it supports the awareness raising of the entire sector. We work with farmers. We focus on interventions with farmers, but through collective action, it's the entire sector, all actors in the supply chain that are involved. And as a private sector, we could not do it on our own. So for me, raising awareness in the entire sector was an impact, is an impact. As I already said, one of the impact is that now we have a relationship with the government, with the national referral system, and it is thanks to the collaboration. And of course, it supports also our strategy in terms of remediation and addressing root causes, because the CLEAR project and the way ILO managed it was really a source of good stories, success stories, and it was a source of, sorry, the word in English is missing, but of choosing also the type of intervention that we now are implementing in the coffee supply chain. And at the end, I think it developed the network, our network locally in Uganda. We learn from peers, from their experience. We developed the network, and for me, it is the door open to another collective project.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Leveraging that network to make a change on the ground, hopefully very soon. And I think you can all learn more about what some of the efforts of the ground on coffee in Uganda through the website of the project, so that we can share that. Stefano, I hope that the question now it's better. Tell me, what impact are you seeing on the ground or within your company? What impact would you like to share?
I will share in a different way, so I don't change the question, but I will share I think, two nice stories. The first one, what's happening inside Ferrero, because I think it's not only what we are delivering into the ground, but also how the companies are changing. And the second one is what is happening to the kids of our workers. I will start by the second one, which is much shorter. So when we started to deploy our activities was around 2012, 2013. And I think we were quite aligned with what was shared by Aude. So there was a big issue about child labor in cocoa, in hazelnut in Turkey. So how the company react in putting a certain kind of actions in place. And I think we were like Martian at the time, so it was not very well perceived. Now, the nice part of the story is that when the kids and their families are starting to move for the first crop, who normally is apricot or can be other ones like roses, they are already calling the people on the ground for the hazelnut harvest to know where Ferrero and Ilo together are opening the school. So for me, this is a great success because it means that year by year, you are putting the seed in the next generation. So they understand that you are trying to bring some changes, again, with the support of everyone. So Ferrero alone could not do it. Ilo alone could not do it. The authorities alone could not do it. So it is really something that is done together. But I think year by year, with this kind of seeds, we start to see results in the new generation. So the mindset is also changing and they see a benefit for them. Then for Ferrero, we developed a couple of years ago, so it was 2019, what we call the hazelnut charter with our manifesto for sustainable hazelnut. And it's divided in three main pillars where we are underlining our key actions. So there is one pillar which is on the social activities, one on the environmental activities, and the third one is the one on due diligence and transparency. And the first one is the one on the social part, was always focused on child labor. So we always talk about child labor, but it was very generic at the beginning. So it was like the elephant in the room. And we review with the support of ILO, and not only of ILO, the charter. And now the approach is much more holistic. So it's not only we want to see the symptom. No, we want to go back to the root causes, again, with the support of all the stakeholders. And it's not anymore focusing on child labor, but is improving living and working condition for the workers, who for sure inside has child labor, because child labor, again, is one of the symptoms we said before of poverty, and not only. But this support a lot also the change in the company, and not only in the value chain. And for me, this is a very important win, because I think companies need also to be more mature to start to discuss about these topics.
Thanks, Stefano. Great examples. And I think that your last point on the maturity for companies to start going into those topics is something we're seeing more and more, like how do we reach that maturity level, how we accelerate that maturity level to have that approach and those conversations at our company. Eugenie, please give us some sense of the impact of what's happening in DRC on child labor and on the efforts that are taking place by different actors on the ground.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think it's been mentioned as well in our last two interventions, the impact obviously brings a better identifications to the risks at hand, including the root causes of child labor in each supply chain. And every root cause will, differentiate between the geography and the type of commodity at hand. And as we mentioned, Odin, in cocoa, the length of due diligence implementation is much longer compared to the due diligence in copper and cobalt in DRC. It started about 10 years ago with the OECD due diligence framework that came out. So, the maturity, let's say, is not as developed as what we see in cocoa or hazelnut, but it does not mean that the impact is to be minimized. We've seen with the CLMRS and the correct implementation and the piloting system since 2023 that we've managed to identify over 6,000 children in child labor. In the copper cobalt space, where we've been piloting on 14 different artisanal mine sites since 2023, and it's quite a huge number, 6,000. But in this, about a third of the children since 2023, so that's about 2,000 and something children, have received a remediation intervention. So around 1,000 of these children have reintegrated into primary schooling system thanks to our collaboration with UNICEF and supporting children victim of child labor. The ILO has also supported the apprenticeship programs of different young children aged 15 and above to make sure that they are well equipped and trained to integrate into their first decent work by the age of 18. And we have different programs, as I've mentioned, with adults. So this is a type of snapshot that we've seen, but the impact shows that with one centralized system and different partnerships that are collaborating on the same system, the impact can go far beyond hindsight and go into different provinces and actually, reach children that aren't necessarily in just the copper cobalt supply chain, but that have migrated in different supply chains as well, but are still victim of child labor. And the second impact is that through this, we're managing to see larger private sector actors in the mining industry, so different industrial private sector actors that are wanting to see how the CLMRS can benefit their own due diligence system by seeing if there is child labor in the vicinity of their own operations, and seeing how these multinational actors can actually work with the government and support the different remediation activities that they are seeing in their own province or their own communities. So the impact is not only targeting children, but actually regrouping more actors into the same due diligence system. And the last point I want to say on this is that, with a bigger pool of actors, the scaling and the leverage can get far more attraction and better results. There's an African saying that says it takes a whole village to raise a children, right? So it's not just by yourself that you're going to achieve that impact, but it's with the whole village and every single actor that can move forward.
Thank you, Eugenie. I think that's you're all converging into this idea of the multiplier component of the work that we're having, through generations, across territories, from domestic to global supply chains, across actors. Let me now bring you slowly to the end of the questions of this panel with one that, of course, it's forward-looking as we are in this conference on what is it that we need to do more and better. So let me bring back Stefano to the conversation. Stefano, what needs to be done? What is still missing? I mean, we have heard about very positive developments, efforts, impact on institutions and on the ground. What's still missing to be able to actually scale that impact or to better use the resources we have at our disposal?
When we talk specifically from Ferrero point of view on the hazelnut value chain, I would say that we need to close the loop. And I go back to what I shared before. We cannot talk about landscape. We need to talk about human landscape. So we have migrant workers, their families running all around Turkey for 8 months. So we need to recognize in a very open and honestly open way that there is a day before the harvest of hazelnut or any kind of other commodities and a day after the end of the harvest. And we need to try to join effort with other commodities, other supply chain actors to close this loop all the year around. And I think this is where Ferrero and many others are looking more and more. This is the only way really to bring something that is with a tangible value all the year around for the workers and their families. Otherwise, we still work in silos. I think until now we had good results with our silos, absolutely not perfect, but this is not enough. Because if we go back to the root causes, one of the root causes is poverty. The other one is they are not covered all the year around. So how we can do it for us, and I think ILO is also aware and is also willing to close this year-round circle. It will not be easy for sure because it's quite an important challenge, but we know that we have also the Turkish authority on this topic as well. So I think this is the next, I would say, 10-year plan. If we are optimistic, probably it will take a little bit more, but I think this is where we need to focus.
Thanks, Stefano. Closing the loop, and hopefully it will take less than 10 years. Eugenie, what about DRC? What's still missing? What is it what are the priorities? Stefano clearly highlight very concrete priority moving forward. What about DRC?
Thanks, Catherine. I'll try and keep my answer short so that we have time for some Q&A. But I think that the main message here is greater coordination. You know, we've seen the best examples in this panel that when actors move forward together, where we understand the root causes together, this is where the impact can be scaled and where we see that child labor and decent work can actually move forward. And this is where the DRC government is actually pushing for all actors on the ground in the copper cobalt supply chain, and hopefully maybe in 10 years in a new plan go to different supply chains. But we're really calling, well, the government is calling on actors to take part in the CLMRS, whether you are an NGO, a civil society, to become a collaborator in helping identify the children in child labor through the single platform, and to join efforts to create and to implement the remediation and prevention efforts with the DRC government and with the private sector actors on the ground. And it's through this that we'll see, you know, the leverage and the impact that we can create. And secondly, and finally, you know, resources, you know, need to be redirected to understand the root causes of child labor on the ground. And it's through this to understanding, you know, what was the level of poverty, the absence of education, social protection, that we can actually make sure that our prevention measures and our remediation systems aren't just ticking boxes, but they're actually improving the communities on the ground where these supply chains are at hand.
Thank you very much, Eugenie. And Aude, now back to you. What are we missing? What's a forward-looking example that you would like to share on how do we better use our resources or scale impact?
Scale impact, better use of resources. I would say that we need to continue to harmonize, align, collaborate more. When I say that, I think about especially all data that we collect. It's a lot of resources, it's a lot of time. We still need to continue to align to allow to, again, better identify the root cause. And I would like to mention the pilot that the FAO has developed, the digital tool, that is for me really an example on how we can all use the same source of information and have an harmonized system for monitoring. But we should pay attention to in harmonizing, not standardizing also the interventions. And we should pay attention to not stop the innovation, not stop innovating in the way we address the root causes. So to scale impact, we need to continue to collaborate and we need to continue to innovate.
Great points. Thank you, Aude. I think it has been a very rich conversation. Now we can move to some of the questions of the Q&A. We have received quite a lot, and thank you everybody for staying with us and for participating to the conversation through the Q&A. And let me use this opportunity to bring back the both co-chairs of the Child Labor Platform, because we do have questions also for you. And Mr. Pasha, allow me to start with you. We have one of the questions in the chat. I think is clearly the best question we can ask you is, how can workers' organizations and trade unions be meaningfully involved in due diligence systems, especially in identifying child labor risk in informal and subcontracted part of supply chains? So how can workers' organizations and trade unions be meaningfully involved in due diligence systems? Mr. Pasha, any thoughts on that?
Indeed, a very good question. And what I understand that the most important thing is we should stabilize social dialogue. And we have to make sure that whatever the initiatives are being taken, I mean, trade unions are being involved. For example, as I said, that you might be aware about mica mining in India, and their due diligence process started, and we could able to combat child labor in that area. And good thing that INTUC, International Trade Union Congress, which is an affiliate of ITUC, started working along with the child labor initiatives with many other partners. So what I strongly feel that it is not a sole responsibility of the trade union, but trade union should also work together with the employer federation, with the NGOs, with the solidarity support organizations, and most important with the government agencies.
Great, Mr. Pasha. Thank you so much for those insights. And let me go back to Mrs. Cardona. Mrs. Cardona, we also have a question for you. And I think that question can be expanded to a few others, but let me start with you. We have heard about how collaboration is an essential part of child labor elimination. And then our participant asked us, what are the criteria for ongoing collaboration between organizations like ILO, with NGOs, nonprofits? So what's the type of criteria we should use when we speak about collaboration and how different actors should be part of that collaborative effort? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it has been covered mostly by our panelists, but I think we must be sharing common insights across all sectors so that we can identify all the systemic vulnerabilities that we have. I think this is not a one size fits all, right? We have to really focus on what matters to really drive, to be more resourceful, to be more efficient in regards of the how we can identify and how we can be more consistent on how we can provide solutions, for our communities, how we can provide that collaborative. We also mentioned that we need collaborative actions. We cannot do this on our own. We definitely need more systemic due diligence implementation systems across all different systems in businesses. I would say that, Catherine.
Great, thank you, Ms. Cardoso. That's actually very helpful. Thank you so much. And we have heard from all the panelists repetitively the issue of poverty, right? Poverty being as one of the drivers of child labor in supply chain. So let me go back to Odd and to Stefano. We have a question in this, and I'm going to read the question. Economic stability of agriculture was mentioned and is indeed key in addressing child labor causes. How do the panelists address this issue in their supply chain? So economic stability, poverty. What are your thoughts on this? And I know that's a tough question, but a lot is happening on this front on looking at the economic root causes of child labor on both sides of your work. Who wants to start? Oh, Stefano, who wants to?
I can answer quickly. Indeed, it's a sensitive question, especially when you work on commodities that are very, very volatile. Market prices are very volatile. And so indeed addressing socioeconomic situation of the household cannot be addressed only through sourcing and how you source the product from the community. And that is why you need to have interventions that also support the economic resilience of the communities. And it's about bringing income generating activities. It is about financial, also literacy. For example, one of our panelists mentioned the SACOs, VSLA's Village Saving and Loans Association. So it's all the intervention that are not directly linked to the market price that will support the economic resilience of the communities.
All the interventions that are not connected only to the market price. Thank you. And I think that's an interesting perspective. What about Ferrero, Stefano? How Ferrero is seeing the issue of poverty and the economic root causes of child labor?
I think there are, I would say, two streams, and we have to talk, and I think this is true for all the agri-commodities, about resilient farm and resilient farmers. Resilient farm means we need to have a value chain that is able to survive to climate change, because this is another challenge that is not part of the panel discussion, but at the end of the day is interlinked with poverty, because if the farmer is not able to produce cocoa, hazelnut, or surviving crops, we are bringing him to poverty. And this is the first one. And then to have a resilient farmer. And this is, I think, what you mean. So they need to, in one way, diversify, be respected in terms of when we talk about hazelnut, that the contract of the migrant workers are respected. There, we are talking about a minimum salary in Turkey. What we are doing with ILO is to train all the labor intermediaries that are working in Turkey. So to train them that there is a contract between the workers and the owner of the garden, that there is a respect of which are the rules in the country. And again, we go back to what we say, it's important to work with the local and central authorities. So you cannot do it only Ferrero and ILO, or Ferrero and an NGO, or ILO and an NGO, but you need an involvement of the central and local authorities. So this is one way. But I think when we talk about poverty, I would say then depending on the value chain, but I think that there is really two streams. One is poverty linked to the fact that today, in many cases, we have smallholders who are heavily affected by climate change. Also in countries who are unexpected, like for example, Italy is heavily affected by climate change. And on the other side, we have farmers who are becoming old, less protected, because to be a farmer is a very tough work. We need to recognize it. And not very often our models of action are good enough to close this poverty gap, actually.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stefano. I think it's very useful to hear this differentiation of how we tackle some of the root causes. And for all of those who are listening to us today, I just want to bring to your attention the fact that the ILO is working very closely with CLP members, together with governments, also on the living income in supply chains. The ILO has a program now on that particular topic. So we're looking forward to engaging more on this, because the question is an important and a vital one. Going back to Stefano, there are now new challenges, including climate change, that would make poverty the center of a lot of the efforts moving forward. Eugenie, you mentioned that the child labor monitoring and remediation system was actually available for everybody to understand, to contribute. Can you tell us if that's if that information is public, how people can know more about the system? There is some questions about that.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so the CLMRS is a government tool from the DRC. They have their own public website that you can access. I think that my colleague Sylvia posted the link on our chat. But for more information, you can Google SSRTE DRC, which will link you to the official DRC page, and there you can check the data of the total amount of children that have been identified through this platform, without obviously sharing the information of the child itself. And in terms of how you can join the CLMRS, the DRC government has validated the protocol recently on the how to use the CLMRS as such, which means that different stakeholders such as NGOs, maybe private sector, civil society organizations can actually become an official user of this database to start collecting data on any child identified in child labor, and to work with the government and different stakeholders on the ground to join the remediation efforts. So it's really a huge step ahead to see how many people can actually collaborate on this in the copper cobalt supply chain, and we hope that the database and the tool can actually be used beyond the mining space in Haut-Katanga and Lualaba, and actually be used in different supply chains such as agriculture. DRC has huge potential in agriculture today.
Excellent. Thank you, Jenny, for those very practical details on how to join the system, how to have access to the data. I'm going to conclude with one question in the panel. We have just a few minutes left, but I want to give a chance to all the questions to be addressed. So back perhaps to Odd and Stefano, how do you address and monitor third-party contractors in the supply chain? We know that you are working in very complex supply chains, and the question goes forward and says, is there a specific compliance program that third-party contractors have to go through? So how do you work with those actors in your supply chain? If you can give us any insights before we close this panel. Who wants to start? Stefano, Odd. Stefano, you want to take this one, and then we
I can
We
take
go
this
through.
one, but I need some more explanation to the question.
Okay, more
case.
explanation on the question. Let's see if I think we have the person who asked that question. So it's Mr. or Mrs. Oriogo. Mrs. Oriogo, are you still with us? And if you dare to just take your microphone on and maybe elaborate on your question. Is that, let me see if she's connected. So maybe that's the way I see this question, Stefano and Odd. It's basically, there are a lot of supply chains that are extremely complex. So basically it's not working just with your direct supplier, but you have many other actors that you have business relationships are linked to your supply chain without having direct business relationships. So I think, Stephanie, you mentioned sometimes there is also some labor intermediaries in supply chain. So how do we make sure that those third actors where there is no direct business relationship in your supply chain actually are part of the change? Any thoughts on that? I see. Sorry, Stefano. I think we found Mr. or Mrs. Again, apologies.
Because I was ready to give you an answer who probably is not the correct one, but
I think we have a chance here to hear from the person who asked the question. Please go ahead and ask your question. Probably still muted. Let me see. Let's give it a try. Can I unmute you maybe? I think you are unmuted now. No, unfortunately, I don't think can you hear us or speak? Hello, Mike. I think now you can't, Mrs. or Mr. Segun. No. Okay, we gave it a try, but I think Stefano and Odd, you might have to go ahead and share what you think.
I will try to answer and interpret the question. I hope I will do it in the proper way. Going back to the has-not value chain, for your information, is a value chain where today, with the exception of Ferrero, there is no traceability of goods. So, for example, what we have done, and for us was crucial when we start to develop our first charter, so our first manifesto for sustainable has-not, to develop a traceability system to really understand how the value chain is built, how complex it is. Because, for example, we thought that it was similar to cocoa. And when I mean similar to cocoa, it means that there are 6 or 7 different steps from the farmers to Ferrero. We saw that is a little bit less complex. And these allow us to understand where the has-not are coming from, how they are grown, and then to assess the value chain and adapt our model of intervention. And I don't know if this was the question or it's a little bit wider until...
I hope that answered part of the question, and we're still trying to see if we can have
Because for me, it's crucial. Without traceability, I'm blind.
Right.
Then with traceability, what we do is we engage the supplier with the supplier code, and what our suppliers have to do is to roll out the Ferrero supplier code, where there are all the basic rules in terms of human rights, in terms of environment, in terms of transparency, and they are the one who have to roll it out in their value chain, who is the indirect value chain of Ferrero.
To build in the capacity of some of the direct suppliers or clear guidance for them to be able to cascade that in further in the supply chain. Thank you, Stefano. We're all trying to interpret it. Hopefully this is good meat for our Mr. Segun or Mrs. Oriogo. Odd, any thoughts on this before we conclude the panel?
Yeah, quickly, I understood in the same way the question is about supplier engagement. And indeed, we have a different level of engagement in our supply chains. We engage with suppliers starting with the code of conduct, as Stefano said, and the application of this code of conduct. We also have a due diligence system when we start to work with new suppliers, and that is the entry. And after, our level of effort and of engagement depends on the supply chain. I mentioned that a lot of interventions, a lot of the knowledge and how we address child labor is possible because we have the proximity with the farmers. So of course, where we have direct supply chain, where we have the possibility to engage directly with the farmers, it's where we have most of the impact. And when it is in direct supply chain, we engage suppliers through a due diligence system, compliance system. And I would say, we have not mentioned that, but sometimes a certified supply chain is also a way to engage in indirect supply chain and to have an impact on social topics.
Great, thank you, both of you. I hope that was at least partially the answer to the question. This could open a whole new side event, but unfortunately for us, it's time to close. I want to thank everybody who followed this conversation so actively, including the Q&A. And a big and warm thank you to all our speakers. You were fantastic. The perspectives and the wealth of experience that you bring to the panel was extremely helpful, and I hope it was also helpful for the different supply chains that we have as part of the audience. The side event ends today. We are a few minutes beyond the time provided, but the conference is still ongoing, and tomorrow we'll have a fantastic sessions on root causes, on different interventions, and very concrete examples of how we're moving the needle on this very, very important global challenge. So thank you, everybody. I wish you a fruitful and inspiring 6th Global Conference on Child Labor. See you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.